That tornado warning in effect until 7 o'clock.
Here is the National Weather Service forecast. Tornado watch 879 in effect until 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Climate data that have been collected that extreme heat and heavy downpours, for example, have been increasing in frequency over the past 50 years.
We're in a different atmosphere today. Climate change does have an effect on, virtually every weather event that occurs.
Our weather is something that impacts each of us on a daily basis. If you're a farmer and we don't get enough rain or you get too much rain, well then your crops can be impacted. And if you like to ski and snowboard in the winter and we don't get enough snow in the mountains, well then you can't do your favorite winter sports. And the weather can even impact our moods. If it's been hot and humid for a long period of time, people get irritable, and if it's been raining for a long period of time, I don't know about you, but I get depressed. It's the frequency and the intensity of these weather conditions when tracked over time is what gives us a window into the phenomena called climate change. Experts believe that greenhouse gases actually play a key role in our changing weather.
So greenhouse gases are gases like carbon dioxide and methane, and even longer, more complicated ones like hydrofluorocarbons that accumulate in the atmosphere, and they come from everyday things that we do, driving our cars, getting energy from power plants, all the things that make our life happen at the moment. A lot of them are based on fossil fuels, and as those get emitted up into the atmosphere, they collect, and it basically traps heat within a closed system, which is our planet Earth.
Increases in greenhouse gas levels exacerbate existing conditions. For example, California is not new to storms, tropical systems coming in, causing premature snow melt. California is not new to heat waves. These are situations that have been in the state ever since settlement, pre-settlement for that matter, but they're going to be exacerbated by an increase in greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It has just that, a greenhouse gas effect, which exacerbates existing conditions.
The issue of global climate change has been around for a long time. People now have very large, complex models, and there's a great deal of scientific consensus around the world. The International Panel on Climate Change, which was convened by the United Nations, has more and more data showing what the impacts of climate change will be. Really, the question isn't what the impacts will be, it's when will they come. So everything from reduced snowmelt in the Sierras in California, to the melting of the polar ice caps, to the acidification of oceans, to real health problems in our cities as a result of increased temperatures. So the main thing to remember is it's not global warming. Warming is not the only factor. It's chaotic weather patterns. So the chaos that comes means that in California, for instance, we've had wetter, colder summers, and people say, well, can't be global warming, but really the impacts are not linear. It's very difficult to say this thing happens and then the next thing happens. Weather patterns are hard to predict. What we do see from the trend lines is that in the last 10 years we've had the hottest 8 years on record in record books. So we know average temperatures around the world are increasing, but localized weather patterns can change a great deal.
Greenhouse gases were a special concern for the California state legislators. And in 2006, Assembly Bill 32, also called the Global Warming Solutions Act, was passed. Now this bill set the goal that by the year 2020, the state would reduce its emissions back to 1990 levels. So that's roughly about 30%. Reducing greenhouse gases is only half the equation. The other half was to develop a plan to adapt to existing greenhouse gas levels.
The California Climate Adaptation Strategy started from a governor's executive order from then Governor Schwarzenegger. This executive order called for, among other initiatives, the production of a statewide plan to begin responding to climate impacts. This followed from years of research telling us that even under the best greenhouse gas emission reduction scenarios, we stand to suffer from climate impacts from the ambient level of greenhouse gases that we have already in the atmosphere. For oceans, We already have experienced an approximate 7 inches in sea level rise from a gauge that we have at the Golden Gate. That in turn is going to cause erosion of our infrastructure that are next to ocean areas, bay areas as well. We have a lot of ports, we have highways, we also have economically disadvantaged communities in those areas that stand to be affected. Changing weather patterns will affect the quality and the number of beneficial agricultural crops. We will also see pest species, which they're more competitive under the warmer conditions under climate change. So certain pest conditions will worsen under climate impacts. For water supply, we have an infrastructure that takes water from the third most wettest part of the state, where we get approximately 75% of our rainfall occurring in the upper third of the state, whereas in the lower third of the state we have approximately 80% of the demand. Public health responses from climate change are primarily with heat stress, heat waves, the associated physiological stress from a heat wave, as well as other concomitant effects such as poor air quality. We have issues with economically disadvantaged communities being more susceptible to heat waves simply because they do not have the resources to respond to heat stress. For example, it could be as simple as not having an air conditioner in your house because you can't afford one, or being at the top level of a building and you do not have a means to stay anyplace else that's much cooler. For an average healthy person, that may not be a factor, but if you are elderly, infirm, or an infant, this can be devastating. The state's population is growing. At the same time, that growing population depends on infrastructure that is 1, 40 to 60 years old on average and due to be replaced at a time when we have an economic crisis going on. 2, susceptibility to climate change. We have highways next to the oceans that are eroding. We have rails that buckle under intense heat waves. We have ports that stand to be damaged during storm wave wash because we have a higher ambient sea level. So all of these factors coming together lead to the state having some serious problems if we don't begin to do some ground level planning and make some fundamental changes with how we start to build our infrastructure and the natural and human systems that depend on our activities.
Throughout the state, there's a mix of urban, suburban, and rural areas, with populations that range in size from 3 million in Los Angeles to 90,000 right here in Redding. And as you just heard from Mr. Malchow, there are many reasons to be concerned about emissions levels. But you know, there's hope. And that hope lies within us as individuals and within our communities.
The California Natural Resources Agency is tasked with implementing several key recommendations in the California Climate Adaptation Strategy that deal with the production of planning tools. This is by and large planned for regional and local governments. We have released last May a tool called CalAdapt. It is a web-based mapping, on a very familiar web-based mapping platform, a means to take the huge body of scientific knowledge and distill that down into a graphical interface where the user could see what kinds of climate impacts are to be expected in her or his area. We are also coming out with what's called the Climate Adaptation Policy Guide. This is intended to provide a policy planning framework for local communities using tools like CalAdapt. Once they understand what impacts could happen in their area, what are some approaches they can take for planning for climate impacts?
What we're attempting to do is to formulate a sustainable community strategy for the region, and that's basically a combined land use and transportation plan for the region. The goal or the purpose of that is to develop a long-range plan for the future that's more transportation efficient. Over a third of the greenhouse gas emissions from any region comes from the transportation sector. So our goal is to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and the associated emissions from those vehicles. There's several different ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the transportation sector. Some of them are relatively easy from a Shasta County perspective. I mean, over time, vehicles will become more fuel efficient and emit less pollutants. There's also new technology and fuels and so forth, low carbon fuels that'll help us achieve those goals. But over time, I think we need to be more transportation efficient in our land use. There's some collateral benefits that go along with that, and that includes less time spent in congestion, more time spent with your family, more money in your pocket because you're spending less time on the road. The idea is to get people not only closer to the places that they need to go, but also to give them more transportation options besides just driving in their car by themselves.
On an individual level, transportation, for instance, is the primary source of emission in the state of California, and so reducing the footprint of your transportation, reducing the amount that you drive, reducing your amount of air travel, spending more time walking or riding a bicycle to places that you have to go is a reduction in emissions. Sourcing all of your products more locally, for the most part, would have a smaller carbon footprint because your goods and materials would have traveled a shorter distance.
The renewable energy I have on my property here, it covers 3 areas. I have wind power, I have a 7.5 kilowatt solar voltaic system, and I have hydropower. In the North State, there are probably many potential applications of hydro that are being missed because people simply don't realize that you can push the power as far as you can and have as small a turbine as you can have to power a very large home. In our case, we're 7,500 square foot under roof, and we power this house completely through the winter months with a very small hydro turbine about the size of a car alternator. I chose alternative power sources because of a host of benefits that come with that, and many are overlooked. For example, in an area like the North State, where large acreages can be purchased at a fraction of the price of more serviced properties with power, then given that discount, that amount can be applied directly to a renewable energy system. So in essence, you get a much, much larger piece of property at a far lower price. And if you plug that into the equation of what it costs to do renewable energy, suddenly the renewable energy more or less pays for itself right out the gate. In my case, $100,000 to hook up to PG&E and then sporting a $400 or $500 a month power bill. In my case, in 10 years, I've paid nothing since my original installation, and it would be hard to calculate the savings over that time. Another point I want to make with this, and it does matter, although there is a certain amount of cost and resource that goes into that renewable energy system when it's constructed, purchased, and installed. From that point on, literally decades can go by without any additional impact on the environment. We are not pumping carbon into the atmosphere on a daily basis, and if cumulatively people understood the ramifications of what we face from a constant contamination of our atmosphere, then the viability of an energy system, not only economically but environmentally, cannot be overstated.
My name is Heinz Hammond. I live here in Northern California, and we're here today to look at some of the things I've tried to do to help make my home a little bit more energy efficient and a little more comfortable. We've done some things for ventilation, including whirlybirds, and improved our attic ventilation. It used to be that in the summertime, our attic would retain so much heat that our air conditioner was running continuously. After we improved the ventilation, that problem went away. We've put some solar panels on the garage to heat the pool, put our sprinklers on timers, we've installed some motion lights, we've done a little bit of painting to bring in some reflected light from the outside, replaced all of our doors and windows on the outside. Another one of the things we do is we compost. This unit here was inexpensive, and it works really fast. Within like two to 3 weeks we can have a good composted soil. We'll use it in all of our raised beds, and we get a lot of fruits and vegetables each year from this compost. Because we installed the solar panels on the garage roof for the pool, we were able to totally disconnect the natural gas pool heater. You know, one interesting thing about these solar panels is we had been looking for about a year and we're finally able to get these solar panels for free from someone on the internet that had replaced their roof and didn't want to go to the time and expense of reinstalling them.
I think about the tragedy of the commons, the famous essay, and I think that's the position that we're in right now, where the high impact activities of a single person, they receive all of the benefit of that high carbon lifestyle, but all of the costs associated with that are shared amongst the entire population. So there's not a lot of incentive individually sometimes for us to live in a way and adapt our lifestyle to a more low carbon activities. But if everyone chooses to do the same thing, then we all eventually suffer. And what we're trying to do is to avoid that crisis where all of these small incremental decisions add up to an insurmountable problem that is difficult to address as a society.
One of the great things about living in rural Northern California is that we have this abundance of natural resources available to us. Our mountains, our lakes, our streams, and our forests provide us with many recreational opportunities. But our forests actually play a really unique role when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They essentially act as large sinks that can store carbon.
Through the process of photosynthesis, trees and other living plants remove carbon from the atmosphere. They take CO2 in and turn it into carbon and release oxygen through respiration. So in that manner, trees and forests do keep our air clean. There are a number of different options for forestry and forest land use that can have an impact on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and thus on climate change mitigation. One method is reforestation of lands that were previously forested, but for whatever reason are not currently in forest. So very simply, planting additional trees increases the amount of carbon that can be stored in those trees. Another option is what's often referred to as improved forest management. So perhaps cutting fewer trees, perhaps letting trees grow to a larger size so that more timber can come from one tree. And again, in that instance, when the tree's standing in the ground, it's storing carbon. And when the tree is put into a long-term wood product, for instance, a table, it's storing carbon in that case as well.
In order to successfully reforest native conifer trees in California or anywhere else where there's a Mediterranean climate where you don't have any rain for 3 or 4 months during a very long hot summer, it's really critical to follow all the steps. One of the first things is you need seed from a local adaptable seed source of the proper species and the proper elevation. The next step is to prepare the site for planting, and that's done the summer usually before you plant, and that's done mechanically or with chemicals and sometimes with both, depending upon this unique situation of a site.
So just to revisit the carbon cycle again briefly first, it's natural that carbon cycles throughout various reservoirs, the atmosphere, the ocean, and vegetation and soil primarily. And so there are reservoirs, those elements, and then there are fluxes wherein carbon leaves one reservoir and goes into another, often in different forms, maybe carbon in vegetation and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for instance. And that's just natural, and there's a balance of how much carbon is naturally occurring in those reservoirs. When it's stored, it's sequestered, basically. So carbon is stored in trees, for instance. It's sequestered in the trees.
The potential to sequester carbon in a young forest is enormous. And over time, as these trees grow, over half of their dry weight will be carbon. And in order to make that carbon, put that carbon in the tree has taken out 3.5 times the amount of carbon dioxide to store the carbon in the tree. So that's a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide that's being taken out of the atmosphere and stored in the tree as carbon.
There are a lot of variables that impact the amount of carbon that's stored in a particular forest, or the amount of carbon that's emitted from different land use or different forest management practices. And some of those factors are location, species of trees, and then of course the management practices themselves. Pilot projects allow sort of further verification of those numbers and an opportunity to show other landowners what type of projects are possible on their lands, and to determine what type of projects are possible in various areas. For instance, in Shasta County, is it possible to plant ponderosa pine trees and have them, how much carbon would they capture and store? How much carbon would be sequestered over what time period, and what would the costs be of that project, and then what would the economic financial benefits be to the landowner?
To help answer those questions, the West Coast Regional Carbon Sequestration Project, led by the California Energy Commission, chose Lake County, Oregon and Shasta County, California as a place to try terrestrial sequestration pilot projects. The overall goal of the research was to see how effective afforestation projects could be in reducing state-level greenhouse gas emissions. And in Shasta County, they planted 12 sites, and they had 476 acres of trees that were planted on private property. And there were many reasons why Shasta County was chosen as a pilot site.
There's such a variety of potential project types within Shasta County, because Shasta County's got a wide array of diverse elevations, soil types, climates, and historical contexts. There's thousands and thousands of acres within this broad band in California, and particularly in Shasta County, that now instead of growing forests are growing brush because of the fire histories that have gone on. And the brush that's growing here is not only preventing the trees from getting established, it's also a huge threat to the surrounding forests, because some of this brush is 20 feet tall and hasn't burned in 50 years. And when it burns, it'll be a lot hotter burn than its natural cycle of 10 to 15 year burn. The sites were chosen based upon the first initial screening was just from the office with photos and available information that could be had. And we had, I think, 50 to select from. And the criteria were, in Shasta County, there's really good soils mapping. So we used soils maps as one layer, and also slope. Anything that was too steep didn't make the cut, or too rocky and steep didn't make the cut. And then the other criteria were it had to be a willing landowner and had to have the property fairly well surveyed.
Getting involved with WestCarb gave us the opportunity to take unproductive land and turn it into potentially not only storing and sequestering carbon, but in the future, for future generations, it's going to mean a lot, because 6,000 trees that were planted there are going to mature into a forest that looks a lot like this right here. And it's not going to take us long to do it as it took for this forest to grow, because it's going to be managed well in the meantime. It's going to be a fire-safe forest, not one that isn't susceptible to fire, but if a fire went through this forest and it was on the ground, you can see that it probably wouldn't jump up into the trees, because the stems here are pretty free of ladder fuel.
This is typical of a lower elevation forest site in the Sierras and Southern Cascades. We're at 2,000 foot elevation here, and typically what grows here naturally would be a ponderosa pine type forest with minor amounts of oak and incense cedar and a few other species.
Why would I want to store carbon? You're touching a very, very important part of our family history. We grew up here. And when you grow up in a forest, you learn to love it. I mean, this was a place when I was a kid where you would know where to go because somebody would call a tree by name. And you would go to the Leaning Tower, or you would go to the Sentinel. So a forest has a very personal connotation where every little gulch and stream, you know it by name. And so when my generation inherited this ground, we decided at that point in history that we wanted to see it managed as a sustainable, biodiverse forest in perpetuity. So what did that entail? It entailed putting a conservation easement on the property.
Carbon in an existing forest is measured by the amount of dry weight that's there. We figure out the dry weight by the amount of cubic volume. For years, foresters have been sampling and measuring and inventorying forests for the amount of wood volume that is out there. And the past several years, we've started to incorporate using that information and incorporating in wildlife habitat. And now we're taking the information that's gathered in these inventories to be able to calculate the amount of carbon dioxide that's actually being sequestered.
Carbon credits provide a way to offset existing emissions that are already occurring through primarily use of fossil fuels. Carbon is usually sold through a registry, and there are a number of registries, carbon registries, that exist both in the United States and internationally. And in order to sell carbon through a registry, it needs to be verified. So each registry has its own set of standards and protocols against which the sequestered carbon is verified.
What the West Carb project showed us is that Shasta County is a good place to do carbon sequestration projects. It also showed us that if landowners were to group together and do one large afforestation project, that over time there would be an economic benefit. The impacts associated with greenhouse gases are well understood and documented. Identifying the right set of strategies in order to reduce greenhouse gases, well, that's really up to your local community. What we've seen throughout this program is that our natural resources, our economy, our local food supply, our health, and our weather are all interconnected. And it's that connection that reminds us that for the long-term success of our species, we need to be good stewards of the earth.